Welcome to this preview episode for the Internet of Things Made Simple. I'm Larry Humor. As a reminder, full episodes are going to be available starting November 1st, and I wanted to point out our newly updated webpage, theinternetofThingsMadeSimple.com. This post is about a New York Times article that was recently done, where it compared IoT to two other booming technologies over the last 30 to 40 years, and that's the world of PCs or personal computers and social media. It mentioned how in the world of PCs, there was a vision from the team at Microsoft to put a computer on every desk. And although it's not on every desk in the world, if you factor in tablets and smartphones and the technology they have on board, it's pretty clear that pretty much anyone who wants computing power now has it. The second one was social media, and that was from Mark Zuckerberg, where his goal was to connect the entire world. And again, obviously not quite there. But when you factor in there's over 2 billion people using Facebook and other social media platforms, and I think it's only about 10 or 12 years in, that's a pretty good start. It seems like the next generation of forward thinking will be in IoT, and that's what the article points out. And they're saying that potentially the next motto is put a computer inside of anything and everything. So before we venture down that path of IoT, I'm wondering, have we learned anything? There was a lot of mistakes made in the launch of the first two technologies I mentioned. Are we going to make the same mistakes again? And we'll talk about that after a few second break. So that history doesn't repeat itself, we need to examine what went wrong in those first two technologies, the launch of PCs and social media, and address those potential issues now with IoT before we move too much further. For PCs, there were a number of issues, but the main one I wanted to point out was the fact that the governments allowed for monopolies to start really early on, and that's mainly Microsoft. And that prevented competition, it often stifled innovation, and it caused a lot of issues. And it took millions of dollars and many years for the government to fight Microsoft to break up these monopolies. And if you remember your history lesson, that's everything from removing built-in browsers to allowing other products and so forth. Social media was a bit different. It wasn't so much dominated by big companies, it's mostly by startups who became big companies afterwards. The big issue with social media was the data, and namely, there wasn't a lot of transparency to where the data was stored, how it was stored, what was kept about you, what information was shared with marketers, stuff like that. And obviously the whole Cambridge Analytica thing brought that to light. So we're currently now going through the growing phases of social media with intervention from the Senate and Congress and different places. The stakes might be even higher with IoT, and I don't want to be dramatic when I say that. Because obviously, with billions of PCs sold and a couple billion people in social media, it is a pretty big market. But IoT could be bigger because you're talking about as many as 30 devices per person. And, that would be almost in the trillions over the next little while. The amount of information about you in IoT could actually dwarf social media. And it isn't just personal, it's also businesses as well. In the wrong hands, the data from IoT is potentially threatening to you as a person, to a government, to a military, and much more. We need to move quickly. The big guys are starting to take over. So if you look at Amazon, there seems to be a new Alexa-enabled product, whether it be some of the Echo series and other products, coming out on a daily basis. You've also got Facebook and Google recently announcing data hubs, as well as platforms for hosting, and companies like Microsoft and Amazon's AWS looking at the business side of the data. And finally, you've got Apple, who's always involved in these things and is starting to get much more involved in IoT. Few issues we need to address. Lack of security comes to mind right off the bat. There's kind of 3 different levels of security of IoT products, and unfortunately, not as many of them are the first one, which is products that come out of the box with security enabled and have all the latest security features. So they offer encryption and enhanced password, maybe perhaps a different password for everybody, along those lines. The second kind of product you get are ones that do have those features, but they're either not enabled by default, or it's too difficult for the user to actually enable them. So a lot of these devices are left unsecured. Finally, you have the devices that shouldn't be sold. Not only are they lacking security features, there's no way to actually even bolster them. We also have to worry about data privacy. So in the world of cloud, where we really don't know where the data goes, we need to make sure that companies are held accountable for how they store the data and how they share the data. So first, how they store it. There has to be a minimum requirement from probably the government, I would think, and I'll talk about that in a second, that actually says these are the encryption standards that are required for basic data, and then have it elevate based on the kind of data they're storing. If it's government-based, it has to have a higher level along those lines. So, am I advocating government intervention? It's funny, as a business person, I often hate government regulations because they almost seem like they bring no benefit and they almost always cost money. However, in this case, I think it might be required. If you look at the case of airlines and automobiles, I don't think they ever would have taken the security and privacy and other steps they've taken if it wasn't for government regulation. So, as much as it pains me, I really think we actually do need to have the government step in. And the article from New York Times agrees with me and say, this is what's required, and these are the penalties if you don't follow along. In the last segment, we're going to talk about 3 specific things, and I touched on them a little bit, but I want to reiterate them again on what IoT needs for the future. Back in a second. There's a lot of things the IoT industry needs to propel its growth going forward and to do it in a way that protects people and businesses. But I'm going to talk about 3 different areas for now. 1, we need to have some common standards across the industry. If you looked at what propelled the PC world, it was because that you didn't have to worry, will this HP printer work with my Dell computer, and will they both work with the Windows operating system? There were standards put in to ensure that these things all worked, and they were also put in for the internet. That way you knew that you were able to launch a browser on the different devices without any issues. There really isn't a lot of standards in the world of IoT. Sure, there are things like MQTT for sensors, but I think we have to make it even more. So we have to start doing better work as an industry to actually say that when you buy this sensor, it will work with this gateway, and they will both work with this back-end system, and allow customers to change. Because although I think a lot of companies like to try to be Apple, to have everything from them, I don't think consumers like that very much. And it really is holding back the industry, especially the business market. 2, we need to put in minimum standards, and I talked about that for devices, but it also has to be for hubs as well. There was a great show on CBC Marketplace on smart home where they were able to actually hack in and control the different devices. They didn't actually say if the issue was with the device security or the hub, but I think with so many products out there now, especially on the hub side, we need to make sure there's a minimum standard of security and that it comes enabled by default. The third part has to do with the data. And this is something that Congress has put into the papers and to the world of news so much. I'm not sure I need to talk about it too much, but what I want to get at is, where does that data go and what data is kept on you? Over in Europe, they have much better privacy standards than we have in North America. So I think we need to focus on that. Does the government have to do all of those things? I would hope not. But I think for the third one, with access to data, I think they definitely will have to step in. I would think that the market should look after standards for the different products for IoT. And I'm not quite sure if it's government or industry for security standards for hubs. But to recap, I think what we have to do as an industry is to slow up just a little bit. Don't put the brakes on it. Don't stop selling products. Nothing like that. But we need to start thinking, are we doing this the right way? Are we going to have our PC and social media moment 5, 8, 10 years from now, where we're all going to look back and say, what were we thinking? I think we might. So I do think we need to put the brakes on a little bit. And I do think we need to have some of the leaders in the IoT industry step up, and possibly the government as well. I hope you enjoyed this preview podcast. I'm Larry Bohumer. Full episodes of the Internet of Things Made Simple are going to be available on November 1st on iTunes, Spotify, and just about anywhere else you download your podcast. I also recommend, as I mentioned before, look at our new webpage, theinternetofThingsmadesimple.com. Thanks. Talk soon.